Yeah, it's happening. A video series covering every single Megaman game. This is the beginning of a journey. So of course, we're going to be starting with Megaman 1. And can I just ask, why does nobody ever talk about this game? It's literally the foundation of the entire series. When you look at some of the unique things this game does and just how it stands as a video game, there's a lot to talk about. So let's get right into it. When you look at other video games at the time, you play levels in a fixed sequence with a gradually increasing difficulty. But I think a lot of people take for granted that Mega Man does not do that. Instead, it makes the bold decision of giving the player freedom to play the levels in any order they want. And this has a few interesting consequences. For one, none of the levels are particularly easy. They all have different challenges. And because of that, the player has to experiment with all kinds of levels until they find one they can comfortably win. Another consequence is how it affects progression, because normally when you play a video game, it gets harder with each level you win. But with Mega Man, the opposite happens. When you defeat bosses, you get their weapons, and this makes subsequent levels easier. And this might sound like a very backwards thing to do, right? Why would you ever make a game that gets progressively easier? It doesn't make sense. Well, actually, this game's structure usually fixes that problem, because the first level you win is going to be the level you had the easiest time with. So if you got stuck on a level, you can now win it. But I say usually because there is one decently notable problem with this setup, and in my opinion, one that could have easily been avoided, and that problem is the way boss fights are balanced in Mega Man 1. The game really leans into this rock, paper, scissors setup where some weapons are way better against certain bosses than others, often to a magnitude of 5 or 6 times more damage. Some bosses like Gutsman resist the Mega Buster, so it is incredibly hard to beat them without using their weaknesses. They are just ridiculously hard, and if you ask me, that goes against the entire point of adding free level selection, because now you have to clear the levels in a certain order. And while we're on the topic of difficulty, at this point I should probably mention what version of the game I'm playing. I personally stick to the official releases, so I recorded this footage from the Legacy Collection, which offers both save states and a rewind button, both of which are kind of necessary, because believe it or not, Mega Man 1 is actually one of the hardest games in the franchise. And I think the biggest reason for that is the very limited control scheme. You can move either left or right, you can climb ladders, and you can also jump. Pretty standard 2D platformer logic. But there is no crouch, no slide, no dash. You have no other options for movement. As for attacking, you have a shoot button with a fixed effect, and it can't be aimed or charged. But one of the benefits of having such tight controls is you really are forced to think about every move you make. Because if you rush into a dangerous situation and put yourself in a compromising position, chances are you're going to die. A lot of people who play these early games after playing the X series try to rush through the level and run forward whenever possible, only to get murked. That's because the core philosophy of Mega Man 1 and how you're supposed to play the game in general is so much different from the fast-paced action of the later installments. The game expects you to take it as slowly as possible, to be strategic and methodical. Every time you enter a room, you are supposed to chart a map in your head and then execute that very precisely. Once you understand that, the game becomes much more enjoyable. You can see here that I spent a good amount of time watching enemies before moving forward. Whenever I reached a screen transition, I would have to utilize its respawning effect to really nail down the group of enemies I'd have to pass. So all of that is fine and good on paper, but the problem is, a lot of the time, you really cannot react to most of the things in this game. And look, I don't have a problem with hard games. It's just that there are a lot of things in this game that are immaculately stupid. Even if you take it as slowly and methodically as possible, the game decides to hit you with a ton of surprises. Like, take these flying enemies in Cutman's level, for instance. They move very strangely based on the difference in height from Mega Man, and this makes their patterns often jarring and hard to fight. Something often pops out of the walls and messes up your game plan. Sometimes the game goes overboard with enemy design design and enemy placement, and there are projectiles just everywhere on the screen. Other times, there's no rhyme or reason to how insane their hitboxes are. I mean, just look at this. I'm literally using the rewind feature to position myself directly center of these two projectiles. And after succeeding, they still managed to hit me, which means it's borderline impossible to maneuver around this obstacle. There are also instant death spikes that you could fall into, but some of them don't have visibility, so if you take a leap of faith, it might just be a trap designed to kill you for being adventurous. The only way you're going to sidestep these cheap deaths is by experiencing them. So really, when it comes down to it, the core gameplay is a whole lot of trial and error. You have to constantly fail at things that are impossible to predict just to get past them, and that kind of rubs me the wrong way, especially with boss fights. You need to guess their weakness, if not outright Google it, otherwise you run the risk of a game over. Like, why do scissors beat electricity? I don't understand. There are a good variety of levels in Mega Man 1. Each level has a good musical score and solid artistic direction, and there are 6 Robot Masters in all, opposed to the traditional 8 Robot Masters other games in the franchise have. Iceman's level has these beautiful snowy forests and ice physics. Gutsman's level is a mountainous area with mining themed enemies and parkour, etc. And something that I really love about all these levels is that every little detail, from their shape down to enemy placement, makes them feel like actual geographic locations rather than video game levels. Take this tower level for instance. You climb it vertically, but when you reach the ceiling, you have to go outside and cross over horizontally to another tower which goes even further up. But there is a problem I notice with the levels, which is parkour. This game has a lot of parkour, which in itself isn't a problem. This is a platformer, but the way this game in particular handles parkour is kind of agonizing. The jumps themselves are easy, but there are a handful of annoying features that ruin them. For one, when you get hit in the air in this game, you are sent backwards. This means that while you're doing parkour, you literally can get sniped out of the sky and one-shot into a bottomless pit. I can't even tell you how many times I died from this, so I just used the rewind button because screw that. And whenever there are dedicated parkour rooms, there's always something. Either the blocks vanish and appear, forcing you to time your jumps, which is okay, or the blocks are covered in these sliding enemies, and you have to either shoot them in a really precise angle or just take damage to get by. Some of the game's mandatory jumps have a block right above you, so when you jump, you have to jump at the very corner, otherwise you hit your head and fall, and it's really hard to do. But weirdly enough, none of these parkour rooms are punishing. They're just time wasters that feel unrelated to the core gameplay. In my opinion, they don't really mesh well, but it's kind of a minor complaint because none of them are too hard. After clearing all of the levels, a 7th level shows up, which is about 4 or 5 levels combined, including boss rush sections split up pretty well, and 3 new boss fights. I generally don't like boss rushes in Mega Man games for reasons I will explain in their videos, but I don't actually have a problem with this setup in the isolated context of Mega Man 1, because the game is pretty short. It takes about 2 hours to clear, and having rematches with only 6 bosses split between 2 waves is pretty well paced and a climactic addition to the game's finale. It's really too bad these boss fights are mostly not ideal. Something interesting that the lead level designer of this game said is that the enemies were carefully placed within rooms in an order of ascending difficulty, but once you reach the end of the room, there's an enemy that you can easily line up shots with. The level designer then said this easy enemy was intended to give the player the illusion that they were getting better at the game, so they would be more eager to replay it. When I read that, I thought it was pretty funny because I never once felt that way in any level. Furthermore, why would you even say that about your game, even in retrospect? But another thing he said that I find even funnier is that people are more likely to replay the game after feeling they wouldn't have to return to something frustrating. But I mean, just look at this game. It's frustrating for many, many reasons beyond enemy waves. I mean, just look at Yellow Devil. This boss fight is an absolute menace. When you walk into the room, you are greeted with no boss, just an ominous black void. But then you get sneak attacked by a projectile you probably can't react to. And sure, this would be a pretty pretty horrifying introduction to a fight, but then the fight goes on to be completely unfair, because this guy can barely be dodged and only feasibly beaten by one weapon when hit in a weak spot that goes away every time it's hit. So a lot of people back in the day had to utilize a glitch to hit it several times at once. Not to mention, to get to Yellow Devil, you had to clear some really tedious parkour, so back in the day when you couldn't reload or rewind, this must have been torture to beat, because every time you game overed, you would have to redo this parkour. But I have to give the game some credit. Not all of the boss fights are agonizing or frustrating. Some are actually pretty cool. For instance, Cutman feels fairly scaled. There's a copy of Megaman that you have to fight that reuses Elecman's AI, but a nice touch they added was making a change to the weapon you currently have selected. So if you switch weapons to something bad, you can momentarily nerf the boss. It's a really interesting concept that I think is executed quite well here. Mega Man 1 does have some mandatory backtracking. Assuming you didn't have the Guts Buster when you play Elecman's stage, you need to bring it back to get the platforming ability for the final level. But I don't mind this because that ability is super useful. It lets you put down temporary platforms to jump on, and this helps you get past some of the harder parkour sections within levels, which is a really nice touch. So overall, how was my experience with the game? It was one of the video games of all time. Well, as the title of this video implies, I like Mega Man games, so this is no exception. It's usually pretty fun, but the problem is there's not much incentive to go back to this specific one, because objectively speaking, it has a lot of flaws. The other games are more fun, and you're not missing out on any story either. This game has almost no story beyond the manuals and stuff. So I would say that this is a pretty okay first game. It's rough, it needs more polish, but at the time it was very well received, because the graphics and the music were ahead of other NES games. And there's definitely a reason Mega Man stuck around so long. I think that the reason has to do with how unique and refreshing Mega Man as a concept is. You see, when Mega Man was first in its idea phase, Cutman was actually going to be the main character. Could you imagine that? But once the devs started to plot out bosses and ideas, they realized all of them could easily be playable characters. And from that idea, the concept of Mega Man was born. You take the abilities of all of the bosses and get one composite character to use all of their different gameplay styles. Going forward, this means that every game could add new weapons to use, giving it infinite potential for future installments. If nothing else, Mega Man 1 is a stepping stone. Capcom would have plenty of time to learn from its mistakes and to capitalize on its many strengths that made its first game critically successful. And of course, Capcom's next attempt was the much more successful Mega Man 2. That about wraps it up for Mega Man 1. I'm looking forward to covering the rest of the Mega Man games. I hope you enjoyed, take care of yourself, and see you next time.